Let go of her. 4 words. Quiet. Said in a marble lobby that had hosted 3 decades of board meetings, acquisitions, and record earnings calls, and had never once heard Margaret Calloway raise her voice. She didn't raise it now. She never needed to. Security had a homeless woman by the arm, walking her toward the exit. Margaret Calloway, the woman who built one small diner into a 400-restaurant empire, crossed her own lobby and stopped it cold. The stranger wasn't dangerous. She was exhausted, hungry, asking for the kind of small mercy the invisible rarely receive, the kind most people walk past a dozen times a day without noticing. She had no idea whose hand had just closed around hers. 32 years earlier, Margaret was told her newborn daughter didn't survive the night. She never spoke the child's name again, not once, to anyone. Just silence, carried like something she'd earned the right to keep. She built an empire instead. 400 restaurants, so no one would ever again have to ask a stranger for a meal. And still, here was one, 10 feet from her office door. Neither woman in that lobby knew yet who the other one really was. Welcome to Aging Heart Speaks. Get settled, and keep this in mind. This story was inspired by a real-life event. Drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. Trust me, you are going to love it here. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of my upcoming videos. Nora Bennett didn't ask for money. She asked if she could sit down for 15 minutes, out of the rain, and whether there was coffee going. That was all. No sign. No outstretched hand. Just a quiet request. The kind that makes a person invisible, if you let it. The kind almost everyone in that lobby had already walked past that morning, without slowing down. Margaret didn't walk past. She had a foundation for this. A shelter 3 blocks over, funded quietly under a name that wasn't hers. She had a system, cards to hand security, a number for staff to call, a policy that had kept her safe from exactly this kind of moment for decades. It worked. It had always worked. It didn't work today. Margaret pulled out the chair across from her instead, ordered 2 coffees, sat down in a lobby she hadn't sat in for a decade, across from a woman she'd known for 4 minutes, and gave her something she hadn't given a stranger since she was 26 years old. Her name. Not Ms. Calloway. Margaret. Staff at the front desk exchanged a look they wouldn't mention again until much later. She'd almost left before the coffee came. Said she didn't want to be a bother. Said it twice, already rising, when Margaret told her to sit back down. Not a request. Something closer to an order, soft but absolute. It was the first time in months anyone had told Nora to stay. What kept Margaret in that chair, she couldn't have explained that afternoon. Something in the way the woman held her cup with both hands, like she was used to going without. A directness in how she spoke, no self-pity in it, just fact, stated plainly, the way people talk, once they've stopped expecting to be believed. By the time Margaret rose to take the elevator back upstairs, something in her life had already shifted. Something in Nora's had too. Neither woman could have told you what. 2 years, Nora Bennett spent as her mother's hospice aide. Not the agency kind, though she'd trained for that too, years earlier, before any of this. The unpaid kind. The kind where you learn to turn a body without hurting it. How to change a dressing at 3 in the morning without switching on the overhead light. Because bright light hurts more than the wound does when it comes on too fast. Nobody has to tell you to do that for your own mother. You just do it. Ruth Bennett raised her alone, no father in the picture worth naming. And when Ruth's body started failing her, Nora left the agency that employed her and did the work for free, at home, for 2 years, because you don't send an invoice to your own mother. Ruth died in November, 8 months before that lobby, 8 months before the coffee. When it was over, there was $340 in the checking account and a stack of medical bills stapled together, an inch thick, that nobody was ever going to be able to pay. Rent on the apartment was $1,150 a month. Nora missed one payment, then a second. By the third notice taped to the door, there wasn't going to be a fourth. She spent 2 months in her car before the car got repossessed too. Then it was a shelter bed when there was one, a bench when there wasn't, and a kind of invisibility she hadn't known existed before. The specific way people's eyes slide past you on a sidewalk, like you're weather, not a person. That's the woman Margaret Calloway pulled a chair out for. Not a headline, not a cause. A woman who had spent 2 years taking care of somebody else, and 4 months finding out exactly what that costs a person who has nothing left over for herself. To understand what Margaret felt when she saw her, you have to go back further than that lobby, 32 years further. Calloway's had 4 booths and a counter with 11 stools. On a corner most people drove past without slowing down. Margaret was 26, worked the counter 6 mornings a week, and noticed things other people didn't. A widower who ordered the same eggs every day came up $4 short at the register one Tuesday, patting his pockets, apologizing. Margaret rang it up as paid and never said a word about it. Not to him, not to her parents, not to anyone. It happened more than once, over the years. She never mentioned that either. There was a Thursday in the rain when a regular's daughter was late, picking her up. Margaret walked the woman to her car herself, no umbrella, soaked through by the time she got back behind the counter. Nobody asked her to. It wasn't the kind of thing you talked about afterward. It was just what you did, if you were the kind of person who noticed people other people didn't. Her sister Patricia noticed differently. Patricia was 30, 4 years older, and ran the books like she was the only one in the family who actually understood what the diner was worth. Their parents were easing toward retirement, already talking about who'd take it over one day, and Patricia had opinions about that, quiet ones. The kind that showed up in who did inventory alone at closing, whose counts got double-checked without being asked, who got left off which conversations. Nothing anyone could have pointed to and called wrong. Just a current running underneath things, steady as the hum of the walk-in fridge. Faye Whitaker was the opposite of all of it. Margaret's closest friend since they were 19 years old, waitressing summers together before either of them had anywhere else to be. Faye was warmth without an agenda, or so it seemed, the one who showed up early and stayed late for no reason except that she wanted to be there. When Margaret found out she was pregnant, unmarried, 26, in a town that noticed everything and forgot nothing, it was Faye who sat with her the night she worked up the nerve to tell her parents. Not Patricia. Her mother didn't lecture her. Margaret's mother was a woman who said more with a spoon than a sentence, and what she did instead of talking was make the Sunday pot roast exactly the way she always had. Onions browned in bacon fat first, before anything else went into the pot, the same way her own mother had taught her 30 years before that. That night, after the dishes were done, she wrote the recipe out on an index card in her own hand and left it on Margaret's pillow. No note attached to it, just the card. Margaret kept it tucked in her hospital bag 7 months later, the night she went into labor. Her parents weren't there for that part. Her father's heart had been failing for the better part of a year, and her mother was 3 states away at his bedside, unable to get back in time. Patricia wasn't there either. Patricia was taking care of things, she told people, minding the diner mostly, so Margaret wouldn't have to think about the register from a hospital bed. That was what it meant, as far as anyone knew. It would turn out to mean something else. Nobody in that hospital knew that yet. Faye was there instead, the entire night, through 11 hours of labor, telling Margaret she was doing beautifully, that it was almost over, holding a hand that was gripping hers hard enough to bruise. When the baby was born, Margaret asked to hold her before anyone weighed her or measured her or carried her anywhere else. She held her daughter for 6 minutes. She had already picked a name, in the weeks before, and said it once, quietly, against the baby's head, Grace. She would not say that name out loud again for 32 years. What happened after happened fast, and badly. Margaret was bleeding more than the doctors expected, sedated, in and out. When she surfaced enough to ask, it was Faye's voice that answered first, and Faye's hand holding hers. Complications, Faye told her. In the night. Nobody could have done anything. She was so sorry. She wasn't going anywhere. She kept that promise at least. Faye did not leave Margaret's side for 4 straight days. There was a small service, arranged with unusual speed by Patricia, who handled the details so Margaret wouldn't have to. The flowers, the paperwork, a stone with no dates on it, because there'd hardly been any days to put between them. A few months later, Patricia offered to buy out Margaret's third of the diner outright. $18,000. A little under what it was worth, though nobody said that part out loud. It seemed, at the time, like a sister sparing another sister a burden she couldn't carry. Nobody in the family ever spoke of the baby again. Not at Christmas. Not once, in 32 years, did Patricia say her name, or ask about that night, or bring it up at all. Patricia's answer to all of it, for 3 decades, was silence. And everyone took that, for just as long, as Patricia simply not knowing how to talk about grief. Faye talked about it exactly once a year. Every October, on the date, she showed up at Margaret's door without being asked, and stayed as long as Margaret needed her to. 31 years of loyalty like that. She never missed one. That was what Margaret was told, in a hospital bed at 26, by the person she trusted most in the world. It was what she still believed, 32 years later, standing in her own lobby, unable to look away from a stranger's face. Was it true? Nobody sent Nora back into the rain. Margaret saw to that herself. Walked her past security, past the front desk, into a private dining room on the 2nd floor that hadn't held a meeting in months. Told the kitchen to send up an actual plate, not a sandwich. A meal, the kind you eat sitting down, with both hands free. 2 members of staff watched her do it. Neither said a word. Neither one had seen her sit down with a stranger in a decade. Her assistant knocked once, said the 3 o'clock was waiting. Margaret said push it. In 9 years working together, her assistant had never once heard her say those 2 words about anything. Nora ate slowly. Careful, measured bites, the kind of eating that comes from learning not to trust a full stomach to last. She thanked the server twice. She thanked Margaret 4 times before the food had even arrived. Like gratitude was something she'd learned to spend early, in case there wasn't time for it later. Margaret asked what kind of work she'd done. Nora answered without hesitating. Hospice aide, certified. 2 years of private care before that, on top of 2 unpaid years with her own mother. She still had her scrubs, kept folded in a duffel bag, washed by hand in a shelter sink, pressed flat under a mattress overnight, because a wrinkled uniform is the first thing anyone notices at an interview. She'd learned that the hard way. 19 applications, 2 callbacks. Both went cold the moment an employer asked for a permanent address to put on the paperwork. A particular kind of invisible, the kind that comes from having no address at all. The certification renewed every 2 years. $85. It had lapsed 6 weeks ago. She said the number the way you say something you've done the math on too many times. $85. The exact distance between the work she was trained for and the work nobody would let her do. She hadn't told anyone at the shelter that her mother had died in November. There wasn't a form for that. Margaret didn't reach for her wallet. Something old in her, worn smooth from use, told her not to. She'd learned that at the shelter years back. Cash didn't fix what was actually broken here. It just delayed the real question. The plates came, Nora ate, and halfway through, before she'd finished her own meal, she started gathering things. Margaret's empty cup, a used napkin, stacking them at the table's edge like she meant to carry them to a kitchen that wasn't hers. Nobody had asked her to. She wasn't even done eating. Margaret reached over and stopped her hand, told her to sit, told her someone else would take care of the plates. Nora apologized for that, for taking up a chair for 40 minutes when she'd asked for 15, for existing at the table at all. It wasn't a reflex Margaret had seen in a stranger before. It was the reflex of someone who'd spent 2 years making sure everyone else was comfortable before she let herself be. Margaret knew that reflex. She'd carried a version of it herself once, behind a counter with 11 stools, a lifetime ago. She didn't say that out loud. What she did instead broke a rule she'd kept for 11 years, since the week she founded the shelter 3 blocks from here. She never got personally involved. Every request went through the foundation, through staff, through channels built for exactly one purpose. So no one on the receiving end of her help ever had a name to call at midnight. A reporter had once asked to shadow her on a Thursday shift, for a piece on the foundation. Margaret said no. A donor's daughter, in real trouble 2 years back, had been quietly placed by staff, and Margaret was told only after it was already done, exactly the way she'd built the system to work. In 11 years, the rule had never once bent. Not for anyone. It bent now. She took a card from her jacket pocket, turned it over, wrote her cell number on the back in pen, told Nora to call her Monday morning. Not the foundation, not HR. Her directly. There was a position opening at the corporate offices. Nothing that would make a headline, but real. Nora asked what it actually was, before she reached for the card. Not what it paid. What it was, whether it involved lifting, whether the hours were steady, whether she'd need a car she didn't have. She asked like someone planning to do the job, not like someone accepting a rescue. Margaret answered every question in order. Kitchen support, to start, in the corporate cafeteria. Steady hours, no car required. The building sat on 2 bus lines. A paycheck. An address that wasn't a shelter. The first thing in months anyone had told her she'd earned, rather than been handed. Only then did Nora take the card. Looked at it like it might not hold up under a second look. Asked, quietly, why? Why her? Out of everyone on that sidewalk this morning, who'd walked past exactly the way she had, why had this one woman stopped? Margaret didn't have an answer. She said something about instinct, about a feeling she couldn't put words to, and every word of it was true. She genuinely didn't know. 32 years of careful distance, Thursday shifts, nobody recognized her at. Checks written instead of names learned. None of it had prepared her for the particular pull of this one stranger's face. She told herself, riding the elevator back up to her office, that it was the scrubs. The dignity of a woman still pressing a uniform she had no job left to wear it to. She didn't quite believe herself by the time the doors opened. 11 years. One rule. Broken in a single afternoon. For a woman she'd known for less than an hour. And she couldn't have told you why. 3 weeks in, Nora Bennett had a badge with her photo on it, and a locker with her name taped above the handle. Small things. She touched the badge more than she needed to that first week. Like she was checking it was still real, still hers, still not about to be taken back. 11 minutes early, every shift, 3 weeks straight. Not once late. Not even the Tuesday the bus broke down, 2 stops short, and she walked the rest of the way in the rain rather than call in. Kitchen staff noticed. They always notice who actually works, and who only shows up. $14.50 an hour, full-time, 38 hours guaranteed. Not a fortune by anyone's math. But it was the first steady number that had shown up next to her name in 8 months. And she checked the account twice that first Friday, like the deposit might not hold. She kept a routine no one asked her to keep, wiping down the same 3 steel counters at the end of every shift, hers or not, because a kitchen that's cared for feels different walking in the next morning. Nobody trained her to do that. She'd just always done it, somewhere, for someone. Faye Whitaker found reasons to be in that cafeteria more often than a chief of staff has any real reason to be near one. She remembered, by the second week, that Nora took her coffee black, a detail nobody had told her twice. She brought down a spare cardigan on a cold April morning and left it folded over the back of Nora's chair, gone before Nora came back to find it. Later that same week, she personally walked Nora through benefits enrollment, dental, the small life insurance policy, forms a chief of staff has no real reason to sit through with a cafeteria hire. Halfway down the form, at the line asking for an emergency contact, Faye's pen stopped moving. Nora had nobody to put there. Faye said it was fine, skip it, they'd circle back, and change the subject before Nora could ask why her voice had gone thin. Patricia noticed something too. She called it something else entirely. She raised it in Margaret's office first, door closed, the language careful and procedural. Protocol, she said. Hiring outside the normal channel set a precedent. Every manager across 400 restaurants would expect the same personal attention. If word got out the CEO had handed her own cell number to a woman off the sidewalk. This wasn't about one hire. It was optics, at scale. Margaret had run this company for 30 years. She knew exactly what protocol sounded like from Patricia, and this wasn't quite that pitch. 10 days later, Patricia tried again, this time with a solution already built. A transfer, she said. There was an opening at a location across town, better hours, a clean reason to move Nora somewhere she wouldn't keep crossing paths with the CEO in a cafeteria. Practical, reasonable, on paper. Margaret said no, flatly, without the usual softening she gave her sister's opinions. It was the first time in years either of them could remember Margaret overruling her outright, and the silence that followed sat in the room longer than the conversation had. The recipe came up the following Tuesday, over nothing. 10 minutes before the lunch rush, a pot of something simmering that wasn't on the corporate rotation. Nora had asked the head chef if she could cook something from home, just once, for the staff who'd been decent to her. He said yes before she finished asking. 3 weeks in, she was already the kind of employee people said yes to without thinking twice. Pot roast. Her mother's recipe, she said, stirring, not looking up. Onions browned in bacon fat first, always, before anything else went in the pot. That part mattered more than the rest. You couldn't skip it or rush it, no matter how hungry everyone got waiting. Margaret was standing in the doorway. She never remembered crossing the room to get there. She said nothing. Nora kept talking, unaware, the way people talk when they think the subject is only food. Said her mother made it every Sunday of her childhood, no matter what else was happening that week, good or bad. Said she'd never known where the recipe came from before Ruth. Ruth had only ever said it was how it was done, like the method had no author, like it had simply always existed. The words landed in Margaret like something dropped from a height onto stone. Onions browned in bacon fat first. Not similar. The exact phrase, in the exact order, off an index card that had sat on her pillow one night, 32 years ago, in her mother's handwriting, carried into a hospital, and out again, without the daughter it had been meant for. She said something about the smell being wonderful. She excused herself before it undid her, in front of a room full of people who worked for her. There was more that same week she couldn't unhear either. Nora mentioned it flatly. The way people mention things they've made peace with. Adopted as an infant. Raised by Ruth alone. No father worth naming in the story. She'd sent away once for her original birth record. In her 20s, more curiosity than need. It came back sealed. No names, no hospital. Nothing released without a court order. She had no money to chase. She'd let it go. You learn to, she said, once a door's been shut that firmly. Her birthday came up sideways, filling out a benefits form, asking for a date of birth. March the 14th. 32 years old this year. Margaret didn't say anything in the moment. She took the form, filed it, closed her office door, which she almost never did before 6. She sat there a long time, not working. 32 years old, born in March. Her daughter would have turned 32 this March. If, she told herself, it meant nothing. Thousands of women turn 32 every March. Thousands of mothers, in kitchens with no connection to hers, likely say those same words about onions and bacon fat, passed down by hand, the way recipes are, not by blood. She told herself that. She didn't believe a word of it, and she sat in that office long after the floor had emptied around her, doing arithmetic she didn't yet have the nerve to finish. 2 weeks. Margaret Calloway turned the arithmetic over in her mind before she did anything about it. She hired someone the old way, not through legal, not through anyone who reported to her, an attorney she'd used exactly once before, 20 years back, for a private matter she'd never discussed with another soul since. She paid his retainer from a personal account her sister had never once had access to. $4,000, wired quietly on a Tuesday. She gave him only what he needed: a birth date, a hospital, a town, 32 years gone, and nothing about why. Sealed records don't open for money. Margaret knew that going in. What she was hoping for was a seam, a private arrangement, handled outside the usual channels, tends to leave a messier trail than a legal one does. A name on a receipt somewhere, a signature that shouldn't exist. It took 11 days, and one retired maternity nurse willing to talk, for $2,000, and the promise her name would go nowhere. Nora's search started with a storage unit. $42 a month, on autopay, for a space she hadn't opened since November. She'd kept paying it even hungry, even homeless some weeks, because the alternative was a stranger, emptying it into a dumpster, and there wasn't much of Ruth left in the world, besides what was in those boxes. A steady paycheck changes what a person can face. 3 weeks into the new job, she finally drove out on a Saturday and opened the door. Mostly, it was ordinary. Dishes, a winter coat, a shoebox of photographs going yellow at the edges. Near the bottom of the second box, wrapped in a dish towel like it mattered more than the towel did, sat a slim folder Nora had never seen in her life. Official paper, a raised seal, sealed, stamped once across the top in red, and beneath it, a name she didn't expect to find anywhere near her mother's things. Private facilitator, the document called her. Compensated for arranging placement, the language read, flat and administrative, the way paperwork always is, about the moments that aren't. The name typed beside that line was Faye Whitaker. Nora sat on the concrete floor and read it twice, because she already knew that name, knew the face that went with it. The woman 2 floors up from the cafeteria who remembered, after one shift, that she took her coffee black. Who'd left a cardigan folded over the back of her chair one cold morning and never once mentioned it again. Tucked flat behind the folder was an index card, someone's handwriting, not Ruth's. A recipe: onions browned in bacon fat first, before anything else went in the pot. The same line, the same order Nora had said out loud in a cafeteria 3 weeks earlier, with no idea why it mattered to the woman standing in the doorway. She'd always believed that recipe was Ruth's. It had never once occurred to her to ask. She didn't call anyone that afternoon. Didn't confront anyone the next morning either. Clocked in at 7:45, same as always. Badge, locker, apron. Faye came through the cafeteria at 10, same as most days, and asked how the weekend had been. Nora said fine. Said it evenly, the way you learn to say things when the truth is too large to hand to someone, still holding a coffee cup. She watched Faye's face the whole time, searching it for something she couldn't name, and found nothing there but the same warmth that had unsettled her for weeks now, without her knowing why. The attorney called Margaret that same Thursday, the 11th day, while she was still at her desk. He'd traced an old, informal placement, not through any hospital, not through any agency on record. A facilitator, paid in cash, who'd arranged a handful of quiet private adoptions around that time. He said the name once. Margaret didn't ask him to repeat it. She'd known that name for 32 years. She'd had dinner with that name 11 days earlier. She sat with the phone still in her hand long after the call ended, running back through 3 decades of Octobers. Every single year, Faye at her door before Margaret had even called her, already knowing the date before either of them said a word about it. She'd always taken that as loyalty, the kind you never think to question, because it never once wavered. Now she found herself replaying one October, years back, when Faye had gone quiet mid-sentence and stopped herself so cleanly that Margaret had never once wondered what the rest of that sentence was. Faye wasn't blood. She'd never needed to be. Not in 32 years of showing up anyway. That was what made this unbearable, in a way betrayal by a stranger never could be. 2 women, in 2 corners of the same city, sat that Thursday holding the same 4 syllables, and neither one yet understood what the other one was holding. Nora didn't know Faye answered to Margaret. Margaret didn't know a storage unit existed at all, or that an index card was sitting inside it, in her mother's handwriting, in the hands of the one person alive who could finally tell her whether 32 years of grief had ever been the truth. She only knew one thing for certain, alone in an office that had never once felt this small. Faye had not acted by herself that night. Someone had paid her to do it. The only question left was who, and whether 32 years of loyalty could survive what Margaret was about to ask. Margaret didn't call ahead. She drove to Faye's house herself, something she hadn't done in years, not since before Roy retired and they downsized to the smaller place on Birch Street. They always met at the office, or at Margaret's kitchen table, over coffee Faye made without being asked, the way she'd made it for 3 decades. Margaret sat in her car outside the house, a long moment before she went in. Long enough that Faye saw her through the front window and opened the door before Margaret had even reached the porch steps. She'd promised herself, driving over, that she wouldn't raise her voice. One question. Plain. No performance in it. Did you arrange it? Faye didn't ask what it meant. She didn't ask Margaret to sit, or offer coffee, or do any of the small hospitable things 32 years of friendship had made automatic between them. She lowered herself into a kitchen chair, like her legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold her. Her hands wouldn't stay still in her lap. 31 years of unbroken loyalty came apart in under a minute. She wasn't alone that night, she said. She had never been alone in it, not for 1 hour of the 32 years since. Someone had come to her first, before Margaret was even showing. Someone who knew exactly what Faye needed, and exactly how badly she needed it. Roy had gambled his way into $12,000 of debt to men who didn't send invoices. Margaret hadn't known that either. In 32 years of believing Faye told her everything. Patricia found her on a Tuesday afternoon in the diner's back office and named a figure before Faye had said a single word about her trouble. $15,000. 3 more than the debt itself, Patricia's insurance maybe, that the number would feel less like payment and more like being taken care of. It worked. Faye took the money that same week, arranged the nurse that same week. By the time Margaret went into labor, everything Patricia needed done was already in motion, and Faye was simply the last hand it needed to pass through. She'd chosen the words herself that night in the hospital corridor. Complications. Nobody could have done anything. She'd rehearsed them in the parking lot beforehand, she said, so her voice wouldn't shake when it mattered. Margaret asked, once, why? Why Patricia had wanted it done at all. Faye said Patricia never gave her a real reason. Not that night, not once in the 32 years since. Only that it mattered to her more than anything ever had, and that Margaret would be spared something. In the end, though Faye admitted she was never sure Patricia believed that part herself. Margaret was already doing the arithmetic before Faye finished talking. 4 months after a funeral, with no dates carved into the stone, Patricia had offered to buy out Margaret's third of the diner, $18,000. A little under what it was worth, though no one had said that part out loud at the time. Sparing her grieving sister a burden, Patricia called it. Margaret had thanked her for it. She understood it differently now. Not a kindness, a cleanup. The last loose thread on a plan that was already finished by the time anyone thought to tie it off. And the silence. 32 years of it, Patricia never once saying the child's name, never once asking a single question about that night. At Christmas or any other day it might have come up. Margaret had spent 3 decades reading that as a sister who simply didn't know how to sit with someone else's grief. It was never that. You don't ask questions about a thing you already know every answer to. Faye was still talking when Margaret stood up from the table, still saying she was sorry, still reaching for something to hold on to that wasn't there anymore. Margaret didn't answer her. She let herself out the way she'd let herself in. Quiet, controlled. Faye wasn't blood, and this had broken something anyway. Patricia was blood. That was supposed to count for more, not less. She had her answer now. She had a name. And for the first time in 32 years, she had the shape of the betrayal instead of the story she'd been handed to carry. What she didn't have, sitting in her car outside a house she might never walk into again, was any idea how a person sits across a table from her own sister and asks her to account for 32 years. Patricia was at her desk by 7, the same as every morning for 30 years. Lights on first, coffee poured before anyone else arrived, the building quiet enough to actually think in. It was a discipline Margaret had always respected in her sister, one of the few things about Patricia that had never once wavered. This morning she used it against her. She timed her own arrival for 6:50, so there would be no one else in the hallway when she said what she'd come to say. She didn't sit down. She said it plainly, the same way Faye had said it to her the night before. $15,000. Paid the week before Margaret went into labor. $3,000 more than the debt itself required. She watched her sister's face the whole time she said it, the way you watch someone when you already know the answer and only need to see whether they'll bother denying it. Patricia didn't deny it. She didn't reach for the coffee sitting in front of her, either. The mug exactly where it always sat, going cold. Small as that was, Margaret noticed it. Patricia noticed everything. She would have noticed her own hand going still. I did what had to be done, she said. Flat. No tremor in it. Nothing like the shaking in Faye's voice the night before. Mom and Dad would have signed the whole diner over the moment they saw you holding that baby. Sole ownership, no vote, a decade of my own work, counting for nothing next to a crib in the back office. I heard Dad say it himself, more than once, before you'd even started showing. Something about how a baby changes what a family owes a person. I believed him. I was 30 years old, watching everything I'd built start to disappear because you were about to become somebody's mother, and I made a decision. I have never once called it a kind one. I've called it necessary. There's a difference, whether you believe that today or not. Margaret asked whether Faye had chosen it too, in the end, or whether $12,000 of somebody else's gambling debt only left her the appearance of a choice. Patricia said Faye had her own troubles that year. Troubles like that don't fix themselves. Margaret let the silence hold before she said the rest. $18,000, 4 months later, for a third of a diner worth considerably more than that. Sparing your grieving sister a burden is how you put it to me at the time. I thanked you for that, Patricia. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I thanked you. This wasn't protecting anything, Margaret said. This was betrayal. You've had 32 years to call it by its right name, and you never once did. For the first time since Margaret had walked in, something moved across her sister's face that wasn't composure. There's a woman 3 floors below us right now, Margaret said, wiping down a steel counter in the corporate cafeteria, because nobody ever trained her to expect anything more than that. I hired her 6 weeks ago without understanding why I couldn't stop thinking about her. She's served you lunch. Twice, that I know of. You stood in line behind her and never looked long enough to see it. She's 32 years old. Her birthday is in March. She spent 2 years caring for a mother who wasn't hers by blood, and 4 months homeless after that mother died, because nobody in this family left a door open for her to walk through. You had 32 years and every resource this company could offer, and you spent every one of them making sure she never knew we existed. Patricia's hands, folded on the desk, had gone still in a way that no longer looked like composure. It looked like something being held in place by force. "Does she know?" Patricia asked quietly. Not whether Margaret intended to tell her, whether she already had. Margaret didn't answer that. She'd come to say what she'd come to say, and she'd said it. She turned toward the door. Behind her, Patricia said her name once, the way she used to say it when they were girls, sharing one bedroom above a diner that didn't yet have a single location past that corner. Margaret didn't turn around. She walked back to the elevator, the same way she'd walked in, unhurried, spine straight, giving nothing away to the 2 employees who stepped aside to let her pass. It would be hours before anyone else in that building learned anything had happened in Patricia's office at all. 3 floors down, a woman neither of them had told anything yet was starting her shift, wiping down a counter that wasn't dirty, the way she did every morning, for people who still didn't know what she was to them. Patricia was gone from the building by 9 that same morning. No board vote, no drawn-out process. Margaret still held what she'd always held, since the day she'd taken one diner national on her own signature, and she used it now. Effective immediately, the letter read. Security walked her to her car, the same courtesy the company extended anyone, no better, no worse. 30 years of double-checked counts and rooms she'd been quietly left out of, ended in the time it takes to clear a desk. Faye's letter went out an hour later. There was no way around it. She'd taken $15,000 and a woman's trust in the same week, and both had a cost. But Margaret made sure of one thing before she signed it. Nobody had told Faye to slip that recipe card into the file. Nobody had paid her for it. In the middle of the worst thing she'd ever done, she'd done one small, unbought thing. Given a stranger's daughter something to hold on to besides paperwork. It didn't buy back what she'd done. It was the one part of that night that had never been bought at all, and Margaret let it stand as exactly that. She found Nora in the same private room upstairs where they'd first sat down together, 6 weeks earlier, over a plate no one had made her feel guilty about eating. She said Nora's mother's name first, Ruth, because Ruth had raised her for 32 years, and blood doesn't outrank that, whatever the rest of this conversation was about to prove. Then she said there was a second mother, one who never stopped believing her daughter had died the night she was born, because that was the story she'd been handed, and had no reason not to believe it. Nora went very still, the kind of still that isn't calm. 32 years old, Margaret said, born in March. Raised 2 towns over, told her birth records were sealed, because they were, sealed by 2 people who never should have had the right to seal them. She said the name once, Grace. The name she'd chosen and spoken exactly one time before, 32 years ago, against a baby's head, in a room she'd never once let herself remember out loud since. Saying it now, 3 floors above where they'd first met, felt like grief and relief arriving in the same breath. 32 years of one, and something she didn't yet have a word for, right behind it. She didn't ask Nora to become that name. Nora had built 32 years as someone else, and Margaret understood, before she'd even finished the sentence, that the truth doesn't get to rewrite a person's whole life just because it arrived. Nora didn't cry. She asked one question, quiet and level, whether Margaret had known, any of it, before 6 weeks ago. Margaret said no. Not one day of it. Not until a stranger asked her for coffee in her own lobby. Neither woman moved to close the distance between them. 32 years of silence doesn't undo itself in a single conversation, however true the rest of it finally was. What happens next would ask something harder of both of them than the truth just had. 6 weeks later, on a Sunday, Margaret climbed 2 flights of stairs to a 1-bedroom apartment that still smelled faintly of fresh paint. First month's rent, paid from a paycheck Nora had earned herself, not been given. Margaret noticed that. She didn't say so. The kitchen was small. One pot, second-hand, still had its price sticker half scraped off the bottom. Nora was browning onions in bacon fat when Margaret came in. Same as always, same as 32 years back. A habit passed hand to hand, without either of them fully understanding, until now, whose hand it started with. Margaret set something on the counter without a word. An index card, edges gone soft with handling, corners rounded from 32 years in a coat pocket, a drawer, a hospital bag she'd never once had the courage to throw away. She placed it beside the one Nora already had, the one Faye had folded into a file all those years back, the one small thing in that whole arrangement that had never been bought. Same hand, same words, in the same order. 2 cards, 32 years apart, sitting side by side on a counter in an apartment neither woman could have imagined 6 weeks earlier. They didn't talk about Patricia. They didn't talk about Faye. Some Sundays, the pot roast is enough. This isn't the kind of story that ends tidy. Trust broken 32 years ago doesn't rebuild itself in 6 weeks, no matter how much time either of them has left to spend trying. But something carried in silence for 3 decades doesn't disappear. It waits. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, if you're decent enough, what waited finally gets a name again. Family isn't only the blood you're born into. Sometimes, it's the family you find your way back to. One Sunday, one recipe, one earned truth at a time.